or this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are. I know we have a few different time zones in the room. My name is Anna Provin. I'm a project manager at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. For those who don't know us, we are a research, advocacy, and consulting organization working to bring intersectional feminist approaches to foreign and security policy worldwide. So today we are really pleased to be partnering with ActionAid, the Feminist Humanitarian Network, and Shifting the Power Coalition for the 10th official side event in our summit season, which is a whole calendar of events leading up to the first ever Feminist Foreign Policy Summit, taking place very soon now, next Wednesday, the 13th. So I'll just provide a couple of words on the summit just to contextualize today's event before passing over. So the Feminist Foreign Policy Summit, it will be realized in partnership with a number of different governments, Sweden, Canada, Mexico, but also the Open Society Foundations and over 15 leading civil society organizations. And for us, the idea is to bring together the leading thinkers and practitioners in the field to facilitate an exchange of knowledge, best practices, expertise, to support advocacy efforts for the uptake of feminist foreign policy among new actors, but also to take a stand against global inequality and exclusion and militarized policymaking. On the day, we'll have a whole host of sessions on topics from demilitarization and disarmament, to understanding and countering transnational anti-gender campaigns, to climate justice, to anti-racism and decolonization. Unfortunately, due to COVID, on-site participation on the day will be limited, but thankfully we have opportunities to join virtually. So I'll make sure to drop the link to register for anyone who might be interested, but also just the link in general to our website where you can find all of the information about today's side events, the 10 other side events that we've hosted, and the summit itself. But yeah, I don't want to take too much time from today's important discussion. So with that, I'll pass back over to Sandra, who'll take you through the event as your moderator.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you. My name is Sandra Macias del Villar, and I'm the Program Director for Crisis at Global Fund for Women. And I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. So I am very excited because I'm joined by a panel of exceptionary women that have played key roles within the humanitarian sector. And we really are excited to think about why do we need a feminist humanitarian policy in a world in crisis agenda. As you know, we're all currently living under a pandemic, which has not ended. We are going through multiple armed conflicts. There is a war in Ukraine. There's a war in, in other places as well. And we are seeing that the climate crisis is not stopping as well. So within this context of multiple crises, I think it's really important now more than ever for us to think about what does it mean to have a feminist humanitarian policy. And we are really happy that we're able to be with you today to kind of bring to light some of the issues from a feminist perspective within the humanitarian sector. And to really kind of challenge ourselves to learn and kind of think about what are some of the ways that we can move forward and try to make some developments and new approaches within the sector. So today I'm joined by an amazing group of people. We have Michelle Higlin from ActionAid Australia, Sharon Bagwan-Rolls from Shifting the Power Coalition based in Fiji, Ami Misiano from National Rural Women's Coalition in the Philippines, and Mombedo Joa, Organization for Women and Children in Liberia. So we have a great range of perspectives. And I also want to make sure that that this is recorded before we get started, obviously, and we're going to have right now we're going to have the bios of all of our speakers in the chat, and also feel free to introduce yourself so we just get to know each other within the next hour. So without further ado, I would love our panelists to just kind of give us some introduction in terms of your vision for a feminist humanitarian policy, particularly drawing from your particular perspective and experience. And let's talk about some of the power dynamics, right? As feminists, this is something that's inherent to our analysis, like the power under, over, sideways, which I think is very, it happens throughout the humanitarian sector. So can you give us like 2-minute remarks, starting with you, Sharon, in terms of like, what are you seeing? What's your vision for a feminist humanitarian policy? And thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. You know, in a room of one's own, Virginia Woolf reminds us that for history, Anonymous was a woman, and that women needed dedicated resources too, and I paraphrase here, to be seen and heard. So when considering the humanitarian system, particularly from a Pacific Island perspective, we know that without the dedicated resources for transformative action, women, particularly in the most vulnerable and precarious crisis situations, will continue to be simply regarded as vulnerable. So we're working to change that. So that's the collective vision that we have as the Shifting the Power Coalition, that while we bear the brunt of the climate crisis, we've dealt with a range of political and armed conflicts as well. We also have the solutions. So we're ensuring, amongst other things, that the resources reach the women, and not just financial resources, but the technical support, so that women know that they can say, this is how I want to do this. This is how I want to respond on the ground, but also ensuring that the response is accountable to the women's rights, peace, and security agendas. So I guess across our coalition of more than 100,000 grassroots, intergenerational and inclusive movements across 7 forum countries, with women with disabilities, young women, rural and coastal women, it's a feminist humanitarian policy is one that reaffirms our local knowledge and expertise, our innovation, and our ability to hold systems accountable to our rights, and to bring our perspectives, the women's rights and feminist agenda, into the mainstream of the humanitarian system. So not just like, this is what we're doing for women, but this is how women are going to change the system. Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you, Sharon. I love what you said, the part about to be seen and heard. I think that's really fundamental to what we're trying to do here, and then transformative action, accountability, and reaffirming our local knowledge. I think it's super important to take into consideration. Amparo, can you tell us a little bit about what's your vision for feminist humanitarian policy based on your particular context and experience?
Good evening, good morning. What else? Good afternoon. Yes, we envision a humanitarian system, policies and practice that recognize also, I believe, the local capacities, especially the women, and also has to be inclusive, looking into the intersectionality of different issues that face women, especially the marginalized sectors. It has to be gender responsive and empowering, where there is accountability and transparency, where power really rests on the people in the communities, the local organizations, especially the small organizations of rural women, and not on those who hold the purse or the wallet, or those representing the wallet holders. Thank you.
I love that. I love it. Like the person in the wallet has so much power, but then it's like, who has the power? And it should be within their communities. And I really like that you're bringing that in terms of the local capacities. Mambedo, can you tell us a little bit about what's your vision for humanitarian policy, drawing on your particular experience?
Thank you, Sharon. The feminist space in Liberia is toxic and unaccountable. Grassroots women organizations are always the first to respond, but yet are left out of critical decision-making about how they should respond in terms of crisis. So I would like to see a feminist humanitarian policy, one which takes into consideration everyone collectively and unwaveringly committed to achieving gender equality, whilst recognizing and responding to systemic drivers of inequality and using emergencies as catalysts to advance women's and girls' rights. I want a policy that acknowledges the patriarchal and colonial dynamics within itself, that often exclude and downplay the contributions of those identifying as women and minorities. I want a policy that actively shifts power to women-led organizations working in humanitarian contexts in the global south by ensuring that they are resourced and consistently included, and that their leadership is recognized and made central in shaping the humanitarian system. I want a humanitarian policy that facilitates safe spaces through coordination mechanism, wherein all actors working at all levels can be heard and the expertise of diverse responders, including those identifying as women, is looked up to. And I want a humanitarian policy that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, a system that ensures that nobody is left behind. And that means persons who are most often than not, whose voices are not recognized, such as refugees, women, LGBTQI persons, people living with disabilities, and everyone who has a uniqueness that we do not have a label for. This is my vision of a feminist humanitarian policy.
I love it, Mombeiro. I really want to highlight the fact that what you said, that we're always the first ones to respond. And this is something that I see all the time in any crisis, doesn't matter what it is. It's community organizers that are women-led that are the first responders. It's not an international sector. It's always the communities that organize themselves, yet we're the ones, that the leadership gets completely ignored. And I like what you said in terms of we are the systemic drivers of the response, but also that we're dealing with systemic drivers of inequality. And that the patriarchal and colonial dynamics, I think it's super important to consider. Hopefully we can dig a little bit more as we move forward, and thank you. Michelle, can you tell us from your particular perspective at ActionAid, what is your vision of feminist humanitarian policy?
Sure. Thanks, Sandra, and good evening, everyone. And I would say that Mombeiro, Ampi, Sharon have pretty much said it all. But from my perspective, I think sometimes we have to look at the base. The Red Cross Code of Conduct calls on humanitarian actors to be neutral and avoid engaging in activities of political or ideological nature. And I think that from my perspective, I think we have to rewrite the rules as feminists. For too long, the humanitarian system has remained apolitical, which has largely protected the status quo and entrenched existing power relations. And so particularly in favour of men and large international NGOs. And this is deepening gender and other inequalities in times of crisis, particularly by excluding women from disaster-affected communities and their organisations from decision-making and resources. So from ActionAid's perspective, a feminist humanitarian policy must be political, must seek to shift power and drive gender transformative change. And I think I would just echo those things. We need to see a shift in decision-making, particularly seeing women from disaster-affected communities as agents of change rather than passive beneficiaries of aid. It also means shifting resources and ensuring a greater portion of humanitarian financing is going to local actors and including to women's organisations and networks. And it is about shifting knowledge. And particularly, I think this is one of the things that we think is critical, is this notion of recognising the lived experience, the Indigenous and the contextual knowledge that women from disaster communities have. We need to get rid of all this technical expertise that comes in from outside and start to value the existing knowledge that resides with those communities themselves. I would also just echo, a feminist humanitarian policy must be gender transformative. And at ActionAid, we often talk about the opportunity to seize moments of societal upheaval to catalyse greater action for gender equality. And so that means we have to prepare as much as we respond and invest in long-term approaches that are designed to tackle those underlying drivers of inequality. And the final thing I just want to say is it has to be also a collective agenda. This isn't about grandstanding from any one organisation, but rather how we can all work together as feminists to build a common agenda, to work together to try and really shift power and protect women's rights in times of crisis.
Absolutely, Michelle. Thank you so much for your points. And I really appreciate you bringing the point about neutrality, because I honestly believe that neutrality is on the side of the oppressor. And like, we're not living during times where we can just be neutral. And so thank you for bringing that up in terms of rewriting the rules and the existing power relations, which I think have been super toxic. And that also the notion of the technical expertise, because that's how it operates. So let's dig a little bit more into this, like how the humanitarian system operates in silos, and the impact that this has on women-led place-based actors, which, as we have heard, we are the ones that are the first responders, yet get significantly ignored when it actually comes to the respond and working alongside humanitarian actors. I would love to hear from your experience, Ampi, and how have silos in the humanitarian system impacted the work of women's rights and women-led organizations?
I think that silos happen in humanitarian work when we look at it separately from work in developing capacities of local actors, empowering women's organizations, or if we look at humanitarian work as separate from development work. I think that is where the silos happen. And it is also very difficult when we would say that we are doing this because it is in an emergency situation, even if it is being done 3 months after the disaster. We have experienced some of our partners making us only treating us as staff and not really giving us the opportunity to lead in the response of this work. So that is the effect of if we work in silos, no? Silos in terms of looking at it in separate from development work that we are doing in the ground, and we have these external actors saying that you should do this, you should do that, and not hearing from what we really want to do. It's unfortunate that we still have experienced that, even though we have partners who are also really recognizing the capacities and of the local actors, the women first responders especially.
Thank you, Ampi. I think that really kind of speaks to the issues that we're seeing, right? Like the silos and how the ways that the humanitarian sector responds even 3 months afterwards, and they still operate in silos when we know that our lived realities are not in silos, they're intersectional. Yes. And we're also seeing a co-opting of the different terminologies and work that the feminist movements have been doing. So Sharon, can you tell us a little bit about how has the humanitarian system taken up this concept of this nexus? Maybe can you tell us a little bit about what this nexus is, and has it had any positive impacts in your work?
So I think, to be honest, I haven't really seen the impact, even though I have to admit, I have been an advocate of the peace development humanitarian nexus approach. I advocated for it. We've seen it reflected in the Generation Equality Forum, WPS Humanitarian Action Compact. And I did so knowing that this approach actually reflects the realities of our lives. We don't live in silos, as Ampi was just saying. We have to see the continuum from actually early warning through to the longer term response and recovery. We've known, for example, that when you apply a gender lens to climate action, you're actually helping women shift the power in terms of being able to look at it from a conflict prevention, a protection perspective. And that's been the work that has been going on in the Pacific in the midst of the climate crisis, in the midst of COVID-19. So it hasn't even been, is it about climate change? Is it about COVID? It's about the interlinkages of these crises. So I actually feel that a lot of the work right now is making sure that the system operators, and I say that because these are the people holding on to the silos, they need to support a transformative agenda, what Michelle talked about, and actually be willing to see this shift across the silos. Then the nexus approach will work. We're seeing it in the context of climate security. We're seeing it in the context of, like I said, the fact that women's leadership is in the humanitarian system, but not being seen as women's issues. And I'll give you the example where after TC Winston, which was a massive cyclone in Fiji in 2016, we were all being herded towards the protection cluster because that's where women go. We wanted to talk about the communications cluster because that's where the innovation was about what women were doing on the ground. So we know that appropriate accessible technology is the way to accelerate the change, to get the messages out to the communities, to get women, whether we're organizing on the mat or at the policy table. So I think the nexus approach is that opportunity to redesign the table, where the decisions are made, to once again hold accountable, I'd say, the UN system in terms of driving the humanitarian agenda, as well as the bigger actors in the humanitarian system that are sometimes holding on to that power and not actually also recognizing the diversity of women, which is the nexus as well. We're not a homogeneous group. So we need to have those different experiences coming together. Then we can ensure our definitions of participation, protection, prevention, relief and recovery are all taken into account. So to me, it's still that work in progress, but really actually tackling a lot of people that are holding on to their definitions of nexus. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I really like what you said. It's not climate crisis or another crisis. It's the interlinkages and how we lived our realities and the system operators that really need to kind of recognize this and break it down. And I love also that you mentioned that recognizing the diversity of women. We're not homogeneous, and like we have to take this into account as well. So Michelle, can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the actions that humanitarian actors can take to break down these silos that we're talking about that have turned out to be so problematic, and how can they support women's work to protect and ensure women's rights and needs more comprehensively?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I think we have to stop projectizing women's lives and working within the narrow confines of, you know, donor windows. And so I think the most critical action that humanitarian actors can take is to engage with donors. And that means trying to reset an agenda that enables more flexible resourcing, to be driven by the local needs, because, you know, as we've heard, you know, women don't live in these silos. And so while we continue to accept resourcing on a very limited or narrow window, we'll continue to see this. So I think brokering those conversations between donors, communities and women, I think is a first step. And I'd say that the other thing is that, you know, for humanitarian response programming, we have to keep going back to the root causes and those pre-existing inequalities that were there well before the crisis began. And we definitely see this in the context of protection programming. So we see this sort of huge boost into protection, protection funding, you know, which is designed to try and protect, we could say women's rights, but protect the most vulnerable in a time of crisis. But what we need is actually the funding that is there long-term to end violence against women and to make sure we have women's safety and dignity, you know, at all times. And until we see that balance that is really making investments, you know, well before the disaster hits, we're just going to keep putting band-aids on things. So I think for me, that's the critical issue. Our humanitarian programming needs to take a much deeper lens that definitely starts, you know, well before a crisis starts. And that's really the opportunity of working across the nexus.
Absolutely. And I think you do bring a really good point that we need to engage with donors more deeply and meaningfully and have these types of conversations. So I wonder, Mombedo, if you could tell us about like as a women's rights organization operating at the national grassroots level in the Global South, like what are your challenges with particularly with regards to funding from a feminist standpoint of view? Mombedo, can you hear it? You're on mute.
All right. Thank you. So because women's rights organizations usually access funding through our NGOs, so they are able to hold a lot of power over grassroots women-led organizations. Grassroots women-led organizations have to jump through multiple due diligence hoops to access funding. Due diligence requirements that require such significant amounts of work that many grassroots organizations are not able to access funding at all. In fact, because of some of the large due diligence requirements, some women organizations don't even apply. They don't even make the mistake of applying to these big INGOs. So that means that our NGOs, UN agencies, and other donors usually make decisions about the work that gets done, and usually within very strict funding requirements. There's no space, no flexible space to operate. And so despite it often not being the work that is critical, organizations in Liberia have said that they have, especially within the research that was conducted by FHN, many women-led organizations that we interviewed said that they found themselves handing out buckets and hygiene items during the COVID-19 crisis, when what community members actually needed was medication and feminine-led products. So because they hadn't been able to make the decisions about how funding was pinched and what work was prioritized, so definitely they were not able to, access these fundings. They were not able to make their inputs into the decision-making process. So to answer your question, there are no flexible funding available for grassroots women-led organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mombedo. I think it's really important to bring on your perspective and what are the issues that are faced by local grassroots organizations, particularly when it comes to extraneous due diligence processes that you need to face. And I wonder, Sharon, from your perspective, what needs to change to ensure that funding systems are feminist within the humanitarian action sector?
So I think one thing is a little bit going back to what, the way Virginia Woolf was talking, we need to ask for the resources. So we need to be ready. We need to be supported to ask for what we need and to explain how funding should work for us. And that would mean talking about dedicated, flexible financing, looking at how current feminist coalitions and funding models are actually working, not asking for new systems, but actually really build and sustain on what is there, what has come from our community organizing and mobilizing, ensuring that it is actually uplifting that traditional and indigenous knowledge, that it's investing in mutual learning spaces, that it's ensuring that there's dedicated resources for the diversity of women, particularly for young women's leadership, and that we can engage at multiple levels. This whole idea of, okay, you're women from the community, so you obviously just want to do nice grassroots stuff. We need to be really uplifting that kind of leadership. And I'm really pleased to say that we're seeing it happen. We're able, through the Shifting the Power Coalition, we are talking about the kinds of funding systems that work as a result of the partnership that we have in the coalition with ActionAid Australia. It means that as the coalition program team, we can drive the programs and we've got the kind of support that we need. It means that young women have been able to be innovative about the way that they organize. And now I'm really, quite excited that with this further collaboration with Global Fund for Women, we've now got the Pacific Island Feminist Alliance on Climate Justice that's actually broadening the table, making the table, creating a bigger table for all of us to sit down and talk about climate justice and the different actions. So keep investing, I think, in those models that enable us to get into all the different spaces for conversation. What Michelle was saying, you know, we need to be there, but we also need to be supported to get there as well. Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you, Sharon. I think that's really important. Like funding, we need funding systems that work. And then that on that lens, can you super briefly, Michelle, tell us like what your organization's approach is to funding from a feminist standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, look, maybe Sharon's covered some of it in that, because we've really worked on designing these models together, you know, particularly in the Pacific, you know, through the Shifting the Power Coalition, has been to look at how we can drive more flexible resourcing where, you know, women and their organizations are in the control and the driving seat of that. But I think one of the other things that I think is really important that we haven't touched on, and that is transparency and trust building, which is critical in resources. You know, one of the things that, you know, we've held up as a core principle in the Shifting the Power Coalition has been the transparent sharing of budgets and providing justifications for why resources go where they're directed to, and having full transparency around that. And I think if we saw more humanitarian actors do that with partners, we would actually start to see a greater equalising of the conversation and a greater sharing of resources. The other thing that I do think is important when we're thinking of funding funding issues from a feminist lens is this is a conversation about power, and I think we always need to remember it. It's about who decides what gets funded and why. And, you know, I mean, the protection of women's rights is the least funded of all areas of humanitarian action. Why? Because women aren't at the table. And you know, the issues that women face are not, you know, sort of give way to those sort of visible needs of food, water, shelter. And so those experiences of women, so for example, violence against women that is unseen, or the rising unpaid care work that women perform in every single crisis that increases. These issues are not seen, they're not visible. So I think we have to think about, well, how do we shift power in this dimension and make sure that, you know, local communities, including women, are actually playing a greater role in determining resources. And, you know, and also as feminists, I think to start to think differently. We've been boxed into this way of seeing humanitarian support. I mean, I often wonder, what if we were to direct cash transfers to women to support their increasing unpaid care work in a time of crisis? I think we have to start to think of different models and different ways that we can drive our agenda and work outside the box that we've been planted in.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, transparency is such a simple thing, but yet it's so hard. I don't understand why we're having such a hard time, you know, showing budgets. And that's something that I think it's a great step in terms of transparency and trust. Let's jump to another aspect of the humanitarian sector that we hear a lot about: localization, right? So it's like we need to have an agenda that is localized, but it's like, what's really behind that, and how? I'm really curious, Mombedo, what has your experience been on the localization agenda? Like, how has it impacted your work, and the role of your organization has been able to play within the system? I think we lost Mombedo. So maybe MP, like, can you tell us a little bit about this, and maybe what are some of the outcomes of the different challenges that this brings, and how they impact the whole issue of localization? How does it impact women's lives?
The issue of localization has really been fought for even before the World Humanitarian Summit, I think, because coming from development perspective and from a women's perspective, we see that these humanitarian actors, especially those coming from outside the local communities, they should believe in the capacity of the local population, especially the women. The knowledge and even the indigenous knowledge of women, especially their coping mechanisms, should be recognized. It's not only about them knowing the standards, the different guides that humanitarian system has put up because of the so many years of work that they have been doing. But we in the local communities also have our own ways of really coping, because we have learned from our experiences, and even sometimes and oftentimes the support from the humanitarian actors come very late, or even dictated upon what they want to see being implemented without us being part of the conceptualization, planning, and even monitoring. So I think if support is to local women's organizations are continuously being done, and also knowing their capacities and building on their strength, and also including in the ways of assistance is looking into how to address the gaps of local women's organization. Because as you see, based on our experience, a lot of the budget goes to support the staff of NGOs and agencies. We have very recent experiences, and it's so frustrating, no? But I hope that there would be changes on this aspect, because I know that we also have partners who have been shifting their ways of how to mobilize and recognize local women's organizations' capacities to address humanitarian crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ampi. And I want to give opportunity for Mombedo to give any remarks with regards to their experience within their organization in terms of localization agenda and how it has impacted your work, if you have any remarks about that.
Thank you. Women's rights organizations in Liberia, in that Feminist Humanitarian Network research that Liberian organizations did, if you have access to it, is on the Feminist Humanitarian Network, and in which we interviewed local organizations, and they said they didn't know anything about any grant bargaining agreement made in 2016, with which signatories committed 25% of humanitarian funding going to local actors. And in that research, the local organization said that the grant bargaining agreement is nothing but lip service. So when this commitment to achieve this goal in 2020 was not achieved, no organization, no NGO was held accountable. It is an example of this unaccountable humanitarian system, how promises are made to change the humanitarian system every time. It will take steps towards decolonizing it and shifting it, but these promises are not kept. And this makes grassroots organizations to relegate them to having to push for change in the humanitarian system, at the same time having to do the work to ensure women's rights are currently advanced and protected in crisis. If international actors who currently have control over power and resources in the system are not making the changes they have promised to make, women's rights organizations are forced into having to spend a significant amount of time on advocacy, often targeting agencies that are said to share the same goals. For example, in Liberia, we often see NGOs doing their work and competing with local actors. Local actors are on the ground responding to the crisis. They are being called every day using their own resources and local resources to raise funds when there is money available in these international organizations to do this work. So the localization agenda in the global south is non-existent. And because there's no one to hold these international organizations accountable, these promises have been unkept, and it have relegated local organizations like ours, like KEEP, like CHI, and many other local organizations having to respond using their own resources, which is not fair to women because it makes women poor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mambedo. I think you bring extremely important points, and that the globalization agenda in the global south is really not existing. I think that's something that we really need to keep in mind. I would like to start moving us towards Q&A. I'll do one more question, but I would like to invite our audience to put your questions in the Q&A chat, please, and then we should be able to address a couple of them, I hope, in the last couple of minutes. But just to wrap up, I think, you know, we've heard about this, about whose knowledge, right? And the power dynamics and who really leads, who doesn't, who gets ignored. So Michelle, how do we decolonize knowledge in the humanitarian system and drive a more inclusive feminist approach? And what are some clear steps that we can take about this?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to call it out. You know, traditional humanitarian actors have definitely positioned themselves as the knowledge creators, and communities as the passive receivers of that knowledge. You know, this sort of dichotomy of communities have problems, we have the solutions. You know, local organizations have capacity gaps. We have the technical expertise, that kind of thing. I think we have to call it out. It is racist, it is sexist, and it's colonial. I think that, you know, I mean, ultimately, and I think this has been said by all of our speakers, and we have to keep underscoring that a more inclusive feminist approach would recognise, value and resource the existing capacities, Indigenous knowledge, and the expertise that resides with communities. And it would be really about supporting and enabling and resourcing the self-determination of women, rather than trying to do things for women. Women can do it for themselves. And what we need to do is shift the resources so that women can drive their own agendas. So I think that, yeah, I think we have to challenge ourselves and, you know, understand that we are part of a system that has, you know, position knowledge in such a way and start to make shifts towards that. I mean, rather than publishing researchers, looking at ways that we can lift up the research, the learnings, the analysis of local women's organisations and giving them due credit and recognition, and the resourcing to be able to publish that themselves, I think is critical.
Absolutely. I really like what you said in terms of calling it out. Like, we have a system that it's rooted in racism, sexism, colonial, patriarchal powers, and this can no longer continue to operate as it is. And I think we are just having the conversation by virtue of who's in the room. I think it's a great step towards that. So please, again, put your questions in the Q&A section. And at this point, I think I will name the question, and then I'll invite whoever from the panel wants to jump in, please do. The first question is, how can we empower grassroots women so that they hold policymakers accountable in the midst of poverty? We'll know that policymakers are often government officials and they hold power and other resources that influence the way community act to a situation. Thank you, Serue, for your question, and who would like to respond? Ampi, please go ahead.
I think that we can help empower grassroots women when we support organizing work among grassroots women, because most of the time support goes to other interventions, not on organizing and capacity building, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are the first responders, and they are the ones who are there in the communities to look after each other, especially during crisis situation. External help come late, even from government and also from outside the country. It is always the local actors who really have to come up with ways on how to better understand the situation and what to do about it. So bigger support should be given to organizing communities, organizing and strengthening the capacities of local grassroots women. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so
Sandra,
much.
can I jump in? Can I jump in on this one? Because I think it's also linked to that whole discussion we were having around the nexus. So supporting women to also network and learn together from the community, subnational, national level, even across the region. And not just waiting for the crisis. I think that sustained investment in movement building is so important, because then we can have women talk about resilience, you know, really dive into what is response and recovery, as well as early warning and the, you know, the immediate aftermath of crisis situations. So it's really about sustaining that whole of movement approach. And we're seeing that change, you know, we're seeing the way women were brought together in Vanuatu through the and the Women Talk Together network now, for example, have been able to enable, you know, it's enabled women to lead responses in the midst of COVID. We're seeing it in Papua New Guinea with Mary Got Information, where women are just coming together and mobilizing and working through their networks. So I think it's really about being a lot more organic and also supporting women to navigate through. Somebody else's comment in the chat around government regulations is really also helping governments and that humanitarian system to say you don't have to be this like registered organization, but actually uplifting models of coalitions and community organizing. Thanks.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for that. We have a couple more questions, so hopefully we'll have time, and apologies if we don't get to your question, because there are several of them that are coming in. The next question is about that the localization agenda also contributes to the NGOization of local actors, where they try to just transform into sub-grantees that fit within their grant systems. What would you recommend as a way to counter this?
I'm happy to start this. I mean, look, I think that everything everyone has said up until now about the importance of providing flexible funding that local organisations can use to drive their own priorities, to prepare for disasters, all of that is critical. And I think that that is one of the ways we will counter this, you know, this NGOization that does happen. I think also making sure that funding is going more directly to local organisations is critical. If local organisations are only sub-grantees in a bigger system, and that agenda has already been determined without their engagement at a higher level, then of course they're just going to be implementing the agendas of whoever that grantee organisation is. So I think we need to make sure resources are going more directly and they are going more flexibly and really designed to support the priorities of the organisations themselves. I mean, that is good development practice.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Can I add something?
Yes,
about
super
that? I think the localization agenda is not the reason why there is the NGOization of local actors. It's the system of how there is the hierarchy of bigger NGOs over local NGOs, especially those coming from international NGOs and UN entities, because there is really that uneven power relations between the local and the bigger organizations. Even if we pursue collaborative actions, if this relationship is not built on mutual respect and equal footing on how to go about making the lives of people in the communities really decent, and it won't happen. I mean, it's that system that contributes really to the NGOization. But for us, for example, in PKKK, we have a rural women agenda that guide us into how we want the changes to happen in the lives of rural women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ampi. Next question. Just wondering what your thoughts are on using a feminist approach to addressing the male experiences of trauma in humanitarian situations. They also consist of a significant number of survivors of abuse, notably sexual abuse, and such hyper-focus on gendering programs to address abuse may run the risk of exacerbating the harmful relationship between genders. This is not to override the importance of focusing on female experiences, but just to ask if you think creating this space is important. Anybody wants to answer this one? Michelle, yeah.
Yeah, look, I mean, the feminist movement has been working on violence for decades, for centuries, and I think there's definitely a lot that can be learned from feminist approaches for trying to address and respond to violence. So I would say yes. In terms of creating the space, I think there are organisations that have been set up to try and respond to some of the trauma experienced by men. So I think that there already are spaces and organisations doing that. And I think one of the real challenges for the feminist movement is that often those organisations are able to gather much larger resources than, the women's organisations that have been working on these issues for decades. And that's some of the challenge we have to keep countering.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michelle. Okay, next question, last one. I would love to know more about the panelists' perspectives of how to improve and address accountability. This accountability should hopefully address some of the faults and shortcomings of the humanitarian aid system. Any thoughts about, I know we've talked about accountability in various ways, but if there are any practical points that you would like to address in terms of accountability, we can spend 1 minute on that.
To me, accountability really comes back to the women's rights agenda or the human rights agenda. So we have CEDAW, we have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, just as two conventions. I mean, that should really be guiding it, and not the accountability of not putting the human rights standards aside. It's got to be front and center in any humanitarian response. So it comes back to Michelle's initial point around, we can't afford to be neutral. So accountability is certainly about having all the right systems, etc. I think we get lost in that kind of accountability. So for me, accountability is the accountability to the human rights agenda. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sharon. So we're coming in towards the last 4 minutes of this amazing panel. And I know we kind of barely touched base, like the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, but I think we heard a lot of really powerful statements in terms about how we need to get rid of the patriarchal, colonial, racist systems that are entrenched within the humanitarian sector, and that we really have to take into consideration that this is about our interlinkages, that silos really don't illustrate our lived experiences, and that's extremely important. And recognizing the diversity of women, recognizing the power of local grassroots organizations is extremely important, and how there's a huge opportunity for us to redesign and really reshape how the humanitarian sector is, channeling the lack of that we cannot be neutral at this moment right now. This is just to name a few of the very powerful things all of you said. So I would like to just take 1 minute to do your closing remarks about any key takeaways, any last closing remarks that you would like to do, starting with Ampi.
I think that for the humanitarian system to be more receptive or inclusive of women's perspective or feminist perspective, it has to draw away from its silos, looking into the vulnerabilities, the causes of vulnerabilities of these marginalized sectors, and really listening, ensuring that their participation and voices are at the center, not only pay lip service to gender, women's rights, but really acting on it in real life. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ampi. Mombedo, any last minute brief remarks?
Yes, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. I would just like to say that all this work that we do, it doesn't operate in silos. It's all connected. Women's leadership is connected to the gender-based violence that we all face, and it's also connected to our lack of access to information. You cannot be pushing women leadership and then denying women the funding that should allow them to lead in their communities, especially in patriarchal communities. is hypocritical in this international humanitarian system. Must stop. We should develop policies and adhere to them. We should be faithful to our promises. We should make sure that women-led organizations who work in the trenches have the funding available, have the knowledge, that the knowledge should be respected, and the expertise, which comes from the experiences that they have working in the communities, are also respected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Well, we've heard from the experts, Mombedo and Ampi. So, I mean, I think everything that they've said is really important. But the one thing I would want to finish on is just to say that we are living amidst the biggest global emergency the world has ever seen in the context of COVID-19. And it is estimated to have set back gender equality gains by at least a decade. So I do think as feminists, we have to be thinking about how do we use this moment that we're in right now to catalyze greater efforts towards gender equality. And I think that is our critical agenda, and that should be, you know, underpinning really feminist humanitarian policy and the focus of our discussions.
Thank you so much. And Sharon, any last minute remarks?
Yeah, so I'll go back to my opening remarks. See us, hear us, give us the space to organize on the mat across our feminist movements with young women, with women with disabilities, women of all diversities, scale up our local networks that enables us to prevent but also respond to crises and to tackle the persistent barriers to our leadership and inclusion, and resource us in ways that work for us in a sustainable manner so that you're building up our feminist partnerships and coalitions. Thanks,
Wonderful.
Sandra.
Couldn't have said it better. See us, hear us, engage us, fund us. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining this panel. I hope you found it helpful. Follow all the wonderful organizations that are represented here today. Would be happy to talk to you about anything. And thank you so much for the Center for Foreign Feminist Policy for hosting us. Wishing everybody good day, good night, stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.